there are two aims around this. The first one is to give you a bit more information about what the Hub does so that you can scope your proposal in a way that shows how it fits with the Hub objectives and shows how it is supporting, adding to and enhancing what we're already doing. And the second is if you have any ideas that you want to share with others, perhaps you're looking for further information or collaborations, we really strongly encourage collaborations in this competition, then it might give you a chance to connect with other relevant people. And aligned with that, there's the opportunity to just ask any questions that you have about the flexible funding system and how it works. We've been doing this for quite a while now, so we've got a good method running on how we evaluate these. So we should be able to answer any questions that you might have. So I think we're going to move on to the next slide. Okay, and that's just a rundown of what we'll be doing this afternoon. I hope I'm not going to take 15 minutes presenting the Hub and themes, but you know, I have been known to. And then we're going to talk about land use within the Hub. And then we've got a number of people who have different ideas that they might present as part of this competition. And they asked if they could give a presentation. So we're going to share that out and have a number of different people presenting before at 15:40. We'll be asking anyone who hasn't presented so far and who has some thoughts that they want to share about what they might bring forward or indeed how they might add to some of the ideas they've already heard with new research directions, to share any information that they want to about their own work. And then we will have a question and answer session just before 4 o'clock. So let's move to the next slide. Okay, so introducing the Supergen Bioenergy Hub. I think most of you know that the Hub works across academia, industry, government and society, and we are all about developing sustainable bioenergy systems. We are particularly focused on looking at the UK's transition to an affordable, resilient, low carbon energy future. But you all know that the UK is an island, but is connected. And yet also that our biomass comes from imports and that there are also export opportunities which are important, and that a lot of our research is actually done in collaboration with other countries. So we have at least one international perspective in our presentations this afternoon. So next slide, please, Dan. Okay, so what is the Supergen Bioenergy Hub all about? We divide into a number of topic groups, each of which has its own objective. Topic group 1 is all about resources, about exploring the options that the UK has to produce feedstock for the UK bioenergy system without impacting on food production and looking at environmental and global climate benefits. I'm not going to say much more about that because that will be the topic of the next presentation after this. The next thing that we do after that is we look at pre-treatment and conversion of that biomass. That is split into 3 sections, which are led by 3 different universities in the UK. So the pre-treatment work is led by Imperial College. Jason Hallett does work particularly on ionic liquids. The thermochemical conversion work is led by Tony Bridgewater at Aston University, which is focusing on the impacts of ash on yield, and then we have Chris Hardacre up at Manchester, who leads the work on catalysis and particularly focuses on photocatalysis. So that is where pre-treatment and conversion sits. Of course, once we have converted our material, we have an energy vector. It could be electricity, it could be heat, it could be a bioproduct, it could be hydrogen, it could be a whole host of other chemicals. And the topic group, which is based at the University of Bath, is led by Marcelle McManus, and she focuses on identifying the preferred bioenergy pathways and most appropriate vectors to determine how those fit within the wider bioenergy strategy. So there we're looking at the whole system, but looking at which vectors can deliver which energy demands in the most efficient way for UK PLC. Topic group 4 builds on that very closely, and topic group 3 and 4 work very closely together. But number 4 takes more of a systems perspective, and again, you'll hear a little bit more about that this afternoon, because they are particularly identifying and evaluating the impacts that bioenergy has on a whole host of other areas, on the environment, on climate change impacts, on water, on economics, on job creation, on land use, on the farming systems. So it's about looking at those wider ecosystem benefits and their resilience and their characterization. So that is what the systems work does. And these are all brought together with a particular systems perspective in our case studies. That's what you can see along the bottom. We have recently produced a report on our case studies, which is available on our website. And those are really a small set of selected pathways, futures, systems for bioenergy, which our stakeholders believe can be significant for the UK going forward. So while it's not an exclusive thing, I would suggest that those of you interested in bringing forward a proposal to this call might well be advised to look at that document and see what case studies are in there, because we've went through quite a long process of consultation across our policy, industrial and academic stakeholders in order to identify this short list of systems that we think are particularly significant for the UK and particularly worth looking at. So those are the ones where there is already some work going on. So there are two reasons why you would be interested in this. Number one, to check what's already going on because you don't want to duplicate it. And number two, to ensure that what you are doing is going to complement that and work with it. All of these things will help your proposal's chances of being funded within the hub. Next slide, Dan. Okay, so this is our structure, and really what you see here is a summary of what was on the previous page. We've got the same topic groups, 1, 2, 3, with number 4 in systems wrapped all around it, and we've got the case studies. But the reason we're showing this separately is we also have something that is incredibly important at the bottom, and that is impact. The hub is very focused on delivering impact. We are interested in the flexible funding projects that come forward, therefore also engaging with stakeholders to deliver impact. That impact can be within the hub, and part of the reason that we have flexible funding is to get some of those things, to have improved cooperation, to have greater integration between partners, to allow us to bring in new partners and new ideas into the work that we're already doing, to be able to integrate new bits of science that are going on in other universities and bring their perspectives to what has been going on in the hub, to improve our industrial understanding. And another very important factor is ECR training. The sums of money involved in the flexible funding are relatively small, and one of the reasons for that is we find that that works better for early career researchers and their eligibility to apply for this funding. So we really would love to see some early career researchers coming forward and being involved in these proposals. But external impact beyond academia is important to us too. We work closely with industry. There are a large number of companies. I think we probably have a slide coming up soon that will show you a list of the ones that are fully signed up partners to the hub. We do indeed. Thank you, Dan. Let's flip back to where we were. Okay, we also work with professional bodies, trade associations such as the Renewable Energy Association and the Anaerobic Digestion and Biogas Association, the Energy Systems and Transport Systems Catapult, policy. Dan was just working this morning on a graph that shows the incredible number of different communications and engagement points we've had with different government and statutory bodies over recent months. So there's a huge amount of that sort of interaction going on, and also with bodies such as the Environment Agency, the Committee on Climate Change, etc. And we mustn't forget people. Societal engagement is really important as well. One of the things that the hub is working on at the moment with some rapid response funding, which we had recently, is an app which is being developed on bioenergy by Andrew Welfel up at Manchester. So there's an importance around engaging with the public and demystifying bioenergy, making it more transparent. There is an important stream of work around engaging with NGOs, and there's also an important activity around engaging with the media. So all of those are different pathways through to improving our societal engagement. Do I have another slide, Dan, or is that the last one? We have that, of course, yes. And anything else? Okay, brilliant. So we're going to pass on now to Ian Donaldson, who leads Topic Group 1 on resources, Miriam Rodder, who leads the Topic Group on systems, and Andrew Welfel, who's one of our Topic Group representatives and also works within the systems Topic Group 4. And Miriam and Andrew have also been instrumental in the case studies that we have developed. So I'm going to pass on at that point. I'm going to assume that there are no questions on the very little that I have presented to you so far. And if there are, we'll pick them up in the wider Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Okay, so good afternoon. So I'm Ian Donaldson, and as Patricia has introduced, Miriam and Andrew will also be contributing to the presentation. So we basically wanted to give you a flavour of some of the activities that are currently going on in relation to land use at the moment across several of the existing topic groups within Supergen. So if you could scroll the slide, please. Thank you. So in topic group 1, we're very interested around the availability of land for growing bioenergy crops, and particularly in relation to how we can think about meeting the sort of targets that the Climate Change Committee and others are really advocating if we're going to be contributing to the climate change targets, and particularly the net zero target by 2050. So those are very ambitious targets. So to really deliver on those, we need to understand about the land, its availability, various parameters on that, and also around the productivity of energy crops within those. So on the marginal land side, we're working on the ways that we can define marginal land. So there's different ways of doing that. So we're looking at in relation to how are other people defining that internationally, and thinking about that and different ways that we may be able to identify and define that. Because clearly here the issue is we do not want to be competing with food production. The other aspect is really around at the moment in particular, in one of the big challenges in agriculture around the sort of post common agricultural policy subsidy scheme. So we're in a period of massive change in agriculture. The new agriculture bill is currently going through the House of Lords, and that is going to be moving. It's certainly in England where we have this this ELM scheme, so environmental land management scheme, and there will be similar bills being developed through the devolved governments as well. So there's going to be a lot of change in agriculture, and then clearly understanding the kind of land available for energy crops is important. Then it's a question about the productivity on that, and so we're doing some work, and here's really one of the sort of latest drafts around productivity maps. One of the things we're doing is trying to increase the resolution of those maps for different energy crops, and also comparing that to, if you like, the sort of what other opportunities farmers might have. So really identifying those areas in the UK where the energy crops really do make a lot more, or have a lot more potential relative to other crops that could be grown in those areas. So really it's very much about how can we optimize biomass production, and particularly thinking about the establishment phase, because that's the initial cost of investment. That's often one of the barriers. So how can we potentially think about reducing costs, but also reducing the risk in effect of failure where that might occur by understanding again better about the matching of the feedstock to particular environments and sites in the UK. And then also thinking about what happens, because of course these are perennial crops as well. You know, if a crop's going to be in the ground 10, 20 years, what might a changing climate mean for productivity on that? Another important bit here is very much those cross-cutting themes of how this interacts with land use change, including around soil carbon, greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity. And some of that relates to work that was done under the earlier supergens, and also in terms of some of the work within this one. Also very much working with topic group 2 on the matching of biomass and its quality to end uses, and also thinking about interacting with the case studies, and particularly around the way that energy crops can contribute to negative emissions. So on to the next slide, please. So this is the case studies. So
yeah, that's me, Ian. I'm taking over here. Thanks, Ian. Hi, I'm Miriam Roda, and I lead the topic group systems. So I'm just taking over from Ian because systems was leading on the work pulling together the case studies for Supergen, and Patricia has already mentioned them. These are the overarching case studies we're looking at with our research across all the different topic groups, addressing the resources, the conversion, the vectors, and the wider energy system impacts. And I just wanted to flag them up, as Patricia already did, to give you a bit more specific idea of what the key case studies are we're looking at. Even though they're defined in the report, obviously there are variations to the case studies because we talk about bioenergy, and there's also always some flexibility and variation depending on what specific system you look, and there are always kind of like opportunities to maybe change feedstocks or applications, for example, or do something differently to the conversion technology. So we have a case study looking at hydrogen fuel cells. We have a case study focusing on biorefinery concepts. We have a couple of case studies looking into transport fuels from wastes, looking at different waste opportunities, different transport fuels, and also different conversion technologies for these to produce these transport fuels. Then we have a case study focusing on heat from food waste. And we have a case study also considering bioelectricity with carbon capture and storage. And I can just urge you, if you want to engage with our research, the case studies really are a starting point to look at and see where the core research is focusing on, and where specifically research within vectors and systems is looking on. So I put the link on there, but if you go to the Supergen website, the report is uploaded under our outputs, and it's not a very long report, so it's worth reading and have a look at what we're working on, and a really good starting point to engage with us. So even if people not applying for funding, if they look at them and they think there's something they can contribute or want to discuss with us or are interested in our results, please get in touch. Okay, next slide, please, Dan. Okay, so just a kind of like a snapshot on the relevance of land use and land use change in bioenergy systems, which is part of the research we do in systems. And some of that is already kind of like mentioned by Ian, because you see we have these cross-cutting topics. And one of the key topics in systems is around policy frameworks. And I just put up a few examples here around policy frameworks as land use and land use change, because direct land use impacts and indirect land use impacts are quite relevant to bioenergy policy. But that obviously is just on the bioenergy policy side, but Ian already mentioned that land use obviously plays a big role in, for example, agricultural policies, which already shows the complexity of bioenergy and bioenergy systems, that you have different sectors working hand in hand and together and playing a role, and having these cross-sectoral cutting points where different policies in different sectors come in. But so direct and indirect land use change obviously is a big issue, especially on bioenergy policies, and that relates directly to climate change aspects, because our overall focus of bioenergy systems is the sustainability of bioenergy systems, and environmental impact, including climate change, plays an important role. And there are things like soil carbon impacts important, but also the above ground biomass potential, what type of crops you grow on what type of land, and how they can, for example, mitigate climate change and emissions. But Ian already mentioned as well, and Patricia as well, ecosystem services and wider socioeconomic implications of land use play an important role to our systems research, and that covers really a whole range of different topics, starting from biodiversity, contamination. We have a few presentations following talking about marginal land and using of more kind of like marginal and contaminated land, and the potential of restoring these lands through bioenergy and biomass growth. But we're obviously also interested around the location and the infrastructure and the logistics of bioenergy. So where do you grow things? How close is it to where you need it? What are the logistics of these supply chains, which often has a very strong economic focus as well. Then we're obviously interested around the income and the employment opportunities also related to land use. So how can you bring in, for example, marginal land? What does it mean in creation of new jobs and employment opportunities? And another factor would, for example, be around the value and price and investment of land. So what actually does bioenergy to land? Or if you bring in marginal land or use less valuable land for bioenergy, how would that, for example, affect prices? What investments would be needed and things like this? And as Patricia mentioned earlier, people are very important in our research, because if we do bioenergy, we do it for people. We do it for the society, no matter if it's the people using the energy or the people involved, the actors involved in the supply chain. But then also, for example, recreation plays an important role. There's a lot of discussion also around perception, how land is used, which often is linked around recreation, or how people actually perceive or see countryside and landscapes. But we're also interested in the wider social and societal dimensions around who has access to the land, who makes the decisions, how land is used, which then also leads partly to discussions around energy security. So it's a really kind of like just a snapshot. There are many more things we're interested in, but these are kind of like some of the highlighting topics, and I hope that will kind of like will be picked up in the discussion as well. But I think the key thing really from a systems point of view is the interdisciplinary assessment to capture the dynamics and synergies between different aspects. Even though you have all these different aspects, they're somehow linked to each other and have an effect of each other. So that is kind of like one of the core things we look into the systems research, to understand these synergies and the trade-offs between the different aspects. And I think Andrew will address that a bit more in his slide he's presenting now.
Thank you. Next slide. Hi, I'm Andrew from the University of Manchester. My job here today is basically to give you an introduction to some of the previous and ongoing Supergen research we have in this area. Miriam and Ian are going to be given a good introduction to many of the themes that we work on, so this is going to be a short task for me. But as a high-level point, I think it's really important that the people who develop proposals for this call are aware of the body of work that Supergen has done, and maybe identify some gaps where the work is needed, but also be knowledgeable to be complementary of the work. For example, what we're doing in the case studies and with the systems and resources teams. So some of the work we've done in the past, if you look at the slide, we've done lots of work on biomass resource modelling, looking at how much resources available in different geographies. That is very much, resource availability is very much linked to the land, agriculture, industry, forests, etc., etc. So we've done lots of work around how much resource there is available and where that resource is in the region. And for example, the graphs, the diagrams on the left basically demonstrate the UK, where different types of land use take place. They're demonstrating different types of agriculture taking place. For example, the work going on at Manchester linked to Supergen, which is developing supply chains. For example, if you want to mobilize a certain type of crop residue from agriculture, where is that taking place, and how can we develop a supply chain to make that affordable and sustainable, etc. So we've done lots of work around resource availability modelling and mapping what land use is and how that's linked to bioenergy. In the census section, we also do lots of work around life cycle assessment, and we do that to assess the greenhouse gas performance of different bioenergy systems. And as I said, land is intrinsically linked to bioenergy, because obviously lots of biomass is grown or it's linked to agricultural practices. So how land use change occurs, or indirect land use change, that can have a big effect on the overall greenhouse gas performance of a bioenergy scenario. So we've done lots of work assessing what the impacts are from a land use perspective on emissions. For example, especially we've done work looking at America, importing resources from America, what's going on there, how does that impact the UK's overall carbon budgets, us sourcing materials from America, or indeed produce them here in the UK. So we've done existing work on that, but there is spaces, gaps I think still around, especially the indirect land use change area. So that may be a theme that people want to look at. And finally, the work that's ongoing actually at the minute at Supergen is we're developing a sustainability indicator model. This is designed to basically assess bioenergy supply chains, especially around those case studies mentioned earlier, to basically assess how sustainable these are from different perspectives, the perspectives of people, perspectives of development, what's the impacts on natural systems, and what's ultimately the impact on climate change. So within that, there's quite a few indicators we're developing around land use and land use change and how the land is used. So from a systems perspective, with my systems hat on, it'd be really interesting if people were to take that step further and look at how bioenergy can provide sustainable benefits for the land and for people, development, natural systems. So yes, please be aware of what we've done and what we're currently doing, as it'd be great to work with this potential future proposal to fit it into the wider Supergen portfolio of work. Thank you.
Okay, so we have heard then from the people who are currently involved with Supergen with different themes that we think are most relevant to the land use area. So now we're going to move on to a variety of different people. The first one that we have is Jen Cronin from UCL, who's going to give us 10 minutes on global land use change, bridging disciplines and scales. For each of these, we're going to go through a 10-minute slot. If the speakers manage to do it in less than 10 minutes, we might manage 1 or 2 questions, but otherwise, if you could perhaps pop questions in the chat, then we can pick them up when we get to the roundtable discussion later. Okay, thank you.
Hi, hope you can all hear me. So thanks very much for organising this webinar and having me speak. Really happy to hear about all of the systems work, particularly happy to share some of the work that we've been doing here at UCL and some ideas that are taking shape between some of us, and see what people think about the contribution and also potential collaborations. So I'm going to outline briefly the types of insights on land use change, global land use change, that we've been getting from some recent work looking at it from a few different perspectives. So that's why we talk about different disciplines and scales, and how we see the importance of research that bridges across those scales and different types of methods. And the key is that we're looking for some particular types of interdisciplinary work. So if you go to the next slide. Thanks very much. So starting with some techno-economic modelling, you'll see across the top that I'm going to talk about some spatial modelling and social research as well. So as many of you will be familiar with, techno-economic models can simulate or optimise transition pathways for the energy and land systems and more. And we're getting insights from our work and also, of course, the wider literature on the role of bioenergy overall and for different fractions, so dedicated energy crops, solid residues from crops and forestry. We're seeing the regions that might have potential supply and demand, and that's based on a combination of input assumptions about resources and also modelling results. So it's this kind of hybrid approach. And from that, we're seeing potential trade patterns. So the first kind of gap that I'd start to flag is that I think is one of the things that's somewhat understudied, especially links between the global north and global south. So lots of by Supergen Hub obviously has worked on UK and how to meet UK demands. So particularly interested starting to look at how European demands might be met, or some of the models are telling us might be met with imports from the wider globe. Models are largely including BECCS, some afforestation, some starting to represent DACs, direct air capture, but representation of or assumptions around other land-based carbon dioxide removal and land use change are often quite broad brush. Where land use change is represented, we can start to look at emissions trade-offs between these carbon dioxide removal options. So for example, this chart on the right, just as an illustrative example, is from Isabella Butnar's recent paper and co, which worked with the TM-UCL global techno-economic model. And you see, for example, that we're talking about bioenergy, biomass fractions used in lots of different applications when in 3 different scenarios when BECCS is available and isn't available. That's the kind of insights we're starting to get from there. We've also done some work for UKIRK recently looking at trade-offs between using land for bioenergy crops versus afforestation and the knock-on impacts in the energy system. So starting to try to integrate those systems. And I'd say that we're starting to get some really interesting insights, but assumptions and around land use change and implications of land use change would benefit from some real further examination. And importantly, I think I'd say that applies to much of the land use change elements in techno-economic models that we're currently relying on for understanding the 2 and 1.5 degree pathways, transition pathways. So that leads us on to what we can see from spatial modelling. If you go on to the next slide. Thanks very much. So spatial modelling can provide some higher resolution insights on where land-based carbon dioxide removal can be rolled out. So again, most of this work I think has been focusing on potential for energy crops and forestry, reforestation, afforestation, landscape regeneration. I know of 1 or 2 that starting to look at global potential for enhanced weathering on agricultural land, for example, much less on agroforestry or the synergies and trade-offs between these different types of land use and land use change. So I've put an example here of some work that I've done recently as part of my PhD. This is a map from my modelling work looking at land suitability for 1st and 2nd generation energy crops. And we looked at how this changes under scenarios of climate change. For example, if a big demand and market for energy crops develops, particularly one with international trade, where are the potential production areas? So as lots of you were familiar with, several studies take the approach of identifying abandoned or marginal land for resource assessment. I took a slightly different approach. I call it a kind of exclusionary approach, identifying the overlap between areas that are suitable in terms of climate and soil conditions for dedicated energy crops, and overlap between that and protected areas, forest, food, agricultural land, in order to start to identify potential hotspots for land competition or where significant land use change might occur if a big market develops. So I think the big challenge is to link the insights from these different types of models. As you know, spatial and techno-economic models are linked in some of the big integrated assessment models, but these links still require some more examination. For example, we see some quite coarse assumptions around the use of grasslands. Mentioned impact on people, importantly, in the previous presentations. Grasslands, extensive pasture lands are often treated quite broadly, as far as I understand. And also the degree to which land use change is regulated varies considerably. So we see food first assumptions being used, but I think that has to be quite seriously examined, tested, look at the implications and reality of those, because clearly market forces are important drivers. So linking these models and perspectives is technically as well as conceptually challenging, I'd say, but even more so, people are largely poorly represented. So that leads us on to the next slide of social research. Thanks very much. So you might have seen this cartoon before around the fuel versus food debate a while ago. So the effects of first generation crop cultivation on food security, I think, has been studied pretty extensively. I'd like to highlight some work by Julia Tomei and colleagues in institutions around the world, especially in Latin America, which looks to centre people in this debate, as Andrew particularly talked about earlier, and Miriam. So looking at implications of land use change for food security, but also employment, livelihoods, land access, issues of land tenure, models for which vary enormously over the world, and land rights. There was a recent project, for example, that's just published around studying the impact of expanding sugarcane land in a municipality of Brazil. I'll put the reference down at the bottom, on measures of human development, and whether the benefits are really being seen by people, particularly in most marginalised communities. So many questions remain around how we can ensure, particularly around how we can ensure that dedicated second generation energy crops and other land-based carbon dioxide removal bring tangible benefits for the people in production areas. And I see a real need to apply some of the methods and understanding gained from social research on first generation crops to the land use change that we're expecting or foreseeing for second generation, particularly dedicated crops. And so I've put on this slide distributive and procedural justice. I hope everyone agrees that those are kind of intrinsically important, but research from energy access and reforestation projects also indicate that they're a prerequisite for success, that ensuring that changes work for individuals and households on a very local scale. So with the energy and development group based here at UCL, I'm currently working on what we're calling a research agenda for the topic of justice in the 1.5C transition. What we need to do to ensure that we transition in as fair a way as possible, that respect human rights, resource sovereignty, and lots of that is very relevant to the land use change. Who owns the land? Land as a sovereign resource. Are extensive grasslands really potentially available? What are the impacts on agricultural livelihoods? Things like that. So if you go to the final slide. Thanks. So what we see is a real need for research that bridges these scales and methods that I've just sort of outlined. We talk about integrative approaches that integrate diverse voices on the practicality of the land use change that the models are telling us is needed. So we sort of refer to that as transdisciplinary. And how land use change for climate change mitigation links with efforts to reduce poverty and achieve sustainable development, and importantly under a changing climate. So the spatial modelling that I talked about looks at impacts of climate change on this land that we're talking about. So here I've just briefly outlined an example of how something like this might work, where we're envisaging identifying demands and potential trade patterns for biomass from the large-scale techno-economic models, and particularly transition pathways consistent with strong climate mitigation, 2C and 1.5 degrees. Also the afforestation and other land-based CDR that they're assuming. And from the spatial modelling to identify hotspots of land competition in those scenarios, and then look for case studies to examine the local implications for people and communities in those regions. And we're particularly interested in looking at potential global north-south trade links and production areas in order to provide insights to improve our modelling assumptions, so to extrapolate and bring that information back up to the really large-scale models with respect to social sustainability. Look at the implications with much more detail of what these models are telling us at a really local level based on justice and social justice. Look at some barriers and opportunities for climate mitigation. Are there things that at a really local level could stop the large scale land-based CDR or land use change that we're expecting, and also opportunities, and also start to look at the required safeguards. So if we're looking at like social sustainability indicators that Andrew mentioned, and if we're looking for some kind of sustainability certification, what kind of categories of land use change and categories of impacts might be most important in order to contribute to questions of governance as well. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of some of the examples of how we're looking to integrate this like insights and methods from lots of different disciplines to look at this question of global land use change. So yeah, keen to hear ideas and ideas for collaboration. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that, Jen. I think we're going to have to move straight on, I'm afraid, to our next speaker, who is going to bring us back to the UK, I think, and that's Elaine Jensen from Aberystwyth, please.
Elaine, if you could just unmute your mic, sorry.
Sorry, schoolgirl error. I'm guessing you can hear me now okay. Thank you for the opportunity. I did regret asking for an opportunity to present after the stressful morning it's been, and there are a number of imperfections in the slides that follow, so apologies for that. But yeah, very much coming back to the UK, and although with a wider focus towards the end, but and also specifically to begin with looking at Wales. So I've been working on Miscantha since 2007, and in 2016 I had an opportunity to look at its use in the processes of phytoremediation and phytostabilization, so in using it to bring some kind of remediation to contaminated or marginal lands. Sorry, next slide, please, Dan. So here's a map of, so this is West Wales, a map of the Dyfed and Powys counties of West Wales. And the red dots are some of the abandoned metal mine sites that we have. So this, this presentation is very much looking at the practicalities of growing energy, which is really challenging in all sorts of different ways. So yeah, coming at things from a very kind of ground level, back to basics, I guess. So there's more than 1,300 of these abandoned metal mines in Wales, and the heavy metals are not biodegradable. They cannot decompose into simple compounds. They accumulate in the food chain and they result in toxic effects for living organisms. The drainage from these underground mine workings can have exceedingly low pH. So we've got local mines where the mine drainings can be as low as 2.5 pH. And their leaching and erosion of the waste dumps are major contamination sources. And a main cause of Wales is failure to achieve the Water Framework Directive standards. So if you can just kind of click, and I'll try and keep up with you, Dan. Sorry, there's too much animation on this. So here's Aberystwyth, where we're based. Beautiful Aberystwyth does look a bit like that today, thankfully. Keep going, Dan. Yeah, so this is just outside Aberystwyth is the Institute. This is the campus where I'm based. This was previously the Welsh Plant Breeding Station, also known as IGA, with a 100-year history now in plant breeding. As you can see, it's close proximity to the West Wales ore field, which is to the east and northeast of Aberystwyth. Keep going, Dan. So the sites here that you see are a common feature of our landscape, and we've mentioned public perception, obviously not just of bioenergy, but also the fact that these are historical sites, and there's a lot of cultural feeling and sensitivity that goes along with them. In addition to that, there are a number of these sites are protected for reasons of geochemistry, for archaeology, because of the metallophytes that are living there and so on. So there are, on a practical level, there are issues around whether or not it's permitted or acceptable or even suitable, sensible to grow bioenergy on these sites. Keep going, Dan. The picture from the bottom right hand corner, sorry, yeah, carry on, keep going, it's all right. So Ian mentioned that we're people are looking at the different definitions of marginal land. So there's a couple here: soils with physical and chemical problems, or are uncultivated, or adversely affected by climatic conditions. And obviously, where you've got a substrate that is poor for growing plants, the extremes extreme climatic events that we are seeing more frequently are going to have an even more testing impact on the crops that you're growing. Marginal land is land defined here as little or no potential for profit, and often has poor soil or other undesirable characteristics. So how much is there? I guess some of the other projects are touching on that. Keep going, Dan. A couple of clicks, please. So this paper from 2015 that you're probably familiar with, they talk about there being an estimated more than 6% of agricultural land in Europe is contaminated with heavy metals, and obviously that's just the problem of heavy metals. We're not looking at other contaminants as well, and that's agricultural land rather than other land that hasn't been used for farming. So there is a huge amount of land that is that has potential to be used for remediation, and obviously the growing of energy crops on contaminated land seems much more preferable to growing food crops where the contamination can pass down the food chain. Keep going, Dan, please. So some of the problems to the plants from a plant perspective, the heavy metals obviously one of the primary effects is impacting cell membranes, disrupting the electron transport chain in photosynthesis and DNA molecules, impairing the plant's ability to produce proteins that might otherwise help it cope. You also find that quite often the conditions for the plant are anaerobic, that the metals themselves compete with nutrients, and the metals then become more bioavailable to the plant. There's often a poor biotic network to support plant growth, poor nutrient cycling, poor drainage, the water holding capacity, the cation exchange capacity. You know, these sites are challenging in so many different ways. Next slide, please, Dan. So here is Miscanthus. We've got over 1,500 accessions of Miscanthus that have been collected since 2004. Ian himself has been involved in some of the collection trips from sites across Eastern Asia, including China, Japan, and South Korea, and Taiwan. Miscanthus is a hugely diverse genus. And it's diverse in just about every trait you can think of. And we've been breeding different varieties to look at its use in for different end uses. So I've been working on it since 2007. And as I say, in 2016, I had the chance to look at its potential for use as either phytoremediating or stabilizing sites that are contaminated or very marginal. Next slide, please, Dan. So what can perennial cropping achieve? Stabilization, so just simply to reduce erosion is a big tick. Flooding mitigation, reducing the amount of leachates going into the water bodies. So in Wales alone, we've got 47 water bodies that are failing the Water Framework Directive, and 87 are at risk. The crops can increase the soil health and also provide opportunities for phytomining, which I'll come to. Next slide, please, Dan. And again, if you probably keep clicking away through this. Okay, so this is practical on the ground. This was my first attempt at establishing a trial. This is a really nasty site. You can see some of the levels of contamination, and the water table is very high. The ground is compacted. It's horrendous in so many ways. It's very exposed. Next slide, next click, please, Dan. Did manage to get a crop in the ground. It was alive, or it was showing signs of growth in March when I last visited it, and I haven't been back since lockdown. Next slide, please, Dan. I'm presenting this so that you've got an idea of some of the material that we've got available and the conditions that we're trying to establish plants on. So we've taken soil cores from this site, and we've looked at the soil cores for the presence of metals. And next, if you click again, this is one of my problems. Oh, okay. We've also got a map of so using a portable X-ray fluorimeter, we've got a kind of surface map of this site with the different levels of metals across the surface. Okay, next slide. And I looked at the periodic table and all of the elements that were showing as present using the portable X-ray fluorimeter. And as you can, so all the ones that are outlined in red are the metals that are present. Some of them, or they're elements that are present, some of which are rare earth elements, which has led to an interest by Orla Williams, who is at the University of Nottingham, and she has a fellowship with them looking, she's currently on maternity leave, but she's interested in phytomining of some of these elements from contaminated biomass. You can see, so this is actually from reed canary grass rather than from miscanthus, because I have both species growing on this site. And in some of the plants, we found that the level of uptake of metals by the plant would constitute what would be called a hyperaccumulator if it wasn't for the fact that the plants do look impacted by the metals, so they're not coping well with it. Next slide, please, Dan. So then, as a result of having this little fellowship and getting this trial going, I then became involved in this Miscamar project, which started in 2014. Has finished, but we've now subsequently got a next round of funding. So the Miscamar project looked at a number of different sites in the UK, Germany and Poland. The Polish site is the heavy metal contaminated site, but then we've got factors of marginality in the other sites as well. So these are nutrient denuded or heavy stone content. And so we've been evaluating different accessions of miscanthus on these different sites. Next slide, please, Dan. And looking at a range of factors from this, including the transition from miscanthus to the kind of retransition from miscanthus to a new crop subsequently, so returning the land to say maize farming afterwards. So some of the data from a paper that we're pulling together now, we're looking at the above and the below ground matter. So we've taken cores in the plant in different, so in the center of the plant, at the edge of the plant, and in the interrow between plants, to try and estimate the amount of biomass below ground. And we've got the GNT is a hybrid that we've bred, and MXG is the standard cultivar of miscanthus that is used commercially. And we're trying to evaluate whether we can identify hybrids that will perform better in this kind of difficult climate, a difficult situation on marginal or contaminated lands. And one of the findings from this, bearing in mind the project is a 3-year project, so obviously by the time miscanthus generally takes about 2 or 3 years to get to a mature state. So by the time we're harvesting, or by the time we've come to the end of the project, we're really just starting to get a mature yield. And we can see that there is a difference in partitioning between the rhizome and the root. And also that some of the hybrids are partitioning more biomass below ground than the commercial cultivar MX giganteus. So that this is the UK site, Germany, and Katowice in Poland. Katowice is a very sandy soil, and there's quite a marked contrast between the rhizome and the root partitioning on this sandy soil. So again, is this something? Would this be true across a number of different hybrids, or is this? Is this? How do we factor in these different phenotypes of these different hybrids? Next slide, please, Dan. Okay, so I mentioned that we've been able to get funding, additional funding to continue this. So we now have the opportunity where these field trials have come to maturity. We've received ongoing funding to continue monitoring those sites, and also to have a look at trying to get the agronomy right to establish on some of these really difficult lands. Next slide, please, Dan. So we have a number of different partners. The funding is from Fracture Surplus. We're working with Pro Academia in Poland, who are looking at gasification of miscanthus harvests from these contaminated sites. Hohenheim are doing a lot of work on the life cycle analysis and also the transition. So once we've had miscanthus growing in the land for some time, the transition to return to arable farming. I wanted to highlight this organisation, GTK. Next click, please, Dan. 2 clicks actually. So this company so this guy has a farm where he's growing miscanthus for himself, and he's into fractionation of miscanthus. So he can fractionate the fibres into 18 different types, which can be used for a number of different products. So like egg box production or yeah, all sorts of different uses. And so this project, Miscamar Plus, is looking at, you know, the whole kind of supply chain through to how the products can be used. So not just for energy, but also for packaging. Next slide, please, Dan. Okay, so specific objectives of Miscamar Plus. To decrease the risk of low establishment rates on marginal and contaminated land by evaluating a range of agronomic treatments with miscanthus hybrids on 3 sites, and to monitor long-term yield persistence, biomass quality and impacts on soil health indicators. And that's what I particularly wanted to mention here. So there's 2 things, I guess, take-home messages I wanted to get across in this. One is that we've got all this biomass being produced, some of which is potentially heavily contaminated, some of which much less so. And I know that one of the things, the interest within Supergen has been trying to get a hold of contaminated biomass. But then in this second point, so monitoring long-term yield persistence, biomass quality and impacts on soil health indicators, we were to have partners with INRA in France, and unfortunately that link in the project wasn't able to was unsuccessful, and so we've had to pull the soil health indicator work from them. And so one of the things that I'd be really interested, next slide please, Dan, really interested in looking at flexible funding for would be to try and address some of the issues from these sites where we've already got trials ongoing, try and address some of these the soil health indicators. The benefits of, the root and rhizome penetration into the soil have potential to decrease bulk density and increase water infiltration and organic matter. The rhizospheric activity combined with leaf mulch contributes to soil fertility through improved nutrient capture, retention and cycling. And what we really want to look at is the impacts of miscanthus on environmental sustainability indicators. So if there were other people within Supergen who could work with us on this, then we've got access to existing trials. Next slide, please, Dan. I probably keep going. Yeah, sorry, just some of the, so this is looking at some of the soil, the sustainability indicators. So just studies from looking at wheat, miscanthus and switchgrass, that the species richness under miscanthus was much better under wheat and switchgrass, and that the abundance of various different life forms were higher under miscanthus. And these are the kinds of studies that we want to be able to add to, really, with our field trials. Next slide, please. Keep going, Dan, sorry. And I just wanted to mention this as well, just because I think it's really cool. So this is another option at some point, is to introduce co-cropping. So these studies have looked at the use of a plant that hyperaccumulates a metal in the presence of the species that you're actually wanting to produce your biomass from, and that if you co-crop a hyperaccumulator with your target plant that you want to get the biomass from, that they found that the hyperaccumulator, the presence of a hyperaccumulator co-cropped with your species of interest causes an increase in biomass in your target species, because obviously the hyperaccumulator is dealing with the metals. And I will leave it there. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Elaine. We are running quite a bit behind, and I'm conscious that I certainly have a 4 o'clock meeting to get to, and I'm sure that others do as well. But if we could move on now to Maria Satenko, please, who's also talking about marginal land and cleaning up of metals through a tandem of phytoremediation and biorefineries.
Hello, everyone. Do you hear me? Hello. My name is Maria Satenka. I am from the University of Chester, and I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to present an overview of our work on phytoremediation biorefinery tandem. Next slide, please. But first, I wanted to show you this slide, which demonstrates that the environmental science has seen a paradigm shift over the last few decades. It's no longer sufficient for us to solve an environmental problem so that to clean up contaminated soil, air, or water resources. In addition to that, nowadays, we want to obtain some additional products. Could you click, please? And I had a chance to write an article which ended up in The Independent, where I summarized some examples how environmental scientists nowadays try to turn pollution into something useful, so that they try to generate wealth from waste. Next slide, please. And one of those examples is where we try to combine phytoremediation with biorefinery. We worked on a project, EPSRC-sponsored project, which was called Cleaning Land for Wealth. And the conceptual diagram is represented here. So first, you grow plants on soil contaminated with metals. It could be energy or agricultural crops, it could be hyperaccumulators or even perennial grasses. The plant will accumulate metals, and then you harvest the biomass, and you can extract the metals and recover the metals from the biomass. The higher the value of the metal, the better, because you can then produce nanoparticles, which could be used as anti-cancer agents, or could be used in catalysis or in diagnostics. But what we did further, we used a biorefinery approach to further degrade biomass using fungi and bacteria to procure some useful chemicals. We focused on phenolic compounds of lignin origin because they are known for unique properties. They have antioxidant, antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory activities. But after the degradation of biomass, you have some remaining fibers, and then can be further processed through gasification, pyrolysis, or carbonization. You, for example, can produce carbonized biomass, which could be used as soil enhancer, soil conditioner. You can return that biomass into the soil so that you close the loop, and you can run the second cycle of the phytoremediation process. Thus, by a combination, by tandem of phytoremediation and biorefinery, you can not only clean up soil from metals, but you also can generate some useful products, such as recovered metals of high value, chemicals, or carbonized biomass, for example, or energy. Next slide, please. And we demonstrated this concept, we verified it on the example of nickel. We grew 2 crops, white mustard and sunflower, on soil contaminated with nickel. And then we harvested nickel-enriched biomass and developed a simple method to extract the metal. We then degraded the biomass using Phanerochaeta chrysosporium. This is a white rot fungus, and it's the best known lignin degrader. By doing that, we increased the amount of phenolic compounds which we can extract from the biomass. So we've optimized the process. We have learned a few lessons. More importantly, we demonstrated that the tandem, the approach, is feasible, and you can indeed combine phytoremediation and biorefinery successfully. But this is only half of the story. The second half of the story is this one. Next slide, please. So in fact, along with nickel, we also work with platinum and palladium and arsenic. Platinum and palladium are emitted from catalytic converters, and those precious metals end up in sewage sludge and roadside soil. But what we discovered when we worked with platinum and palladium, that the concentration of those PGMs is so low, it's at ppb level, that the phytoremediation, phytomining, is not feasible to recover those precious metals. But where would we need to go to find high concentration of platinum and palladium in soil? Next slide, please. We would need to go to South Africa, who is the leader in the production of PGMs. And this country is covered with numerous abandoned mines. The soil around those mines is contaminated with PGMs. What is happening in industry currently is that the demand for PGMs is growing, whereas the resources are depleting. And that is why the producers, they come back to the abandoned mines and they reprocess the ores with low concentration of PGMs. And in this context, phytoremediation could be a competitive method. It could be a commercially viable method for phytomining to source PGMs while also bringing wealth to the country, because you can further process the biomass to burn, for example, to generate energy. Next slide, please. And of course, when we talk about contamination with metals, we all know about the huge problem of e-waste processing in China. I took some images from a dissertation of one of my master students who studied informal e-waste in China, and she described huge detrimental effects on the local communities and on the environment in two major towns where all the informal e-waste processing is taking place. And the area is hugely contaminated with metals. And here phytoremediation as well could be a good way to solve the environmental problem, because e-waste is rich in PGMs, and of course there will be some accompanying toxic metals, heavy metals, but there is a huge demand for a solution to solve this environmental problem. Next slide, please. Surprisingly, and unfortunately for us, we don't have to go that far to China or to South Africa to find an environmental problem. During the CLAW project, what we discovered that there is a huge problem of arsenic contamination in Cornwall. We went there and took some samples and some images which you can see here now, and you can see that the area looks like a desert. And we heard some horrible stories how dogs were dying just because they were poisoned with arsenic because they were leaking from local rivers. And next slide, please. And we, as I said, we took some samples, we brought them to the lab, and we analyzed the concentration of arsenic in soil and in biomass which grew there. And as you can see, the concentration of arsenic in soil is indeed very high. It's highlighted here in red. But what surprised us, the concentration of arsenic in some biomass which grows there is also very high. Thus, for example, heather could accumulate up to 200 ppm of arsenic, whereas grasses as well have high concentration of arsenic in them. And we also discovered ferns there. And why ferns? Because ferns are known to be hyperaccumulators for arsenic. What I would say that the biomass there does accumulate arsenic naturally and is just waiting to be collected and processed. And the final slide, please. So that to summarize some take-home messages I summarized here, through our experience working in phytoremediation and biorefinery, we can say that phytoremediation biorefinery tandem is a good, a feasible method, a sustainable way to clean soil. We also can clean water, for example, if we use the water hyacinth. And we also, in addition to that, we can produce high-value products or energy. Based on my experience, I could say that it is more feasible to use phytoremediation in two extreme cases. The first one is when it's driven by a huge contamination problem with heavy metals, for example, or with the arsenic or mercury, or when you target high-value metals like PGMs, for example, in South Africa. Phytoremediation, in fact, can be done with any types of plants, not necessarily with hyperaccumulators. Usually they are endemic and they prefer to grow in warm climates, might not be suitable for the UK, for example. Metals extraction could be facilitated by a special type of bacteria, whereas what we have to pay attention to is the biomass yield. The biomass yield should be the highest to maximize the metals uptake in one cycle of phytoremediation. And of course, here, back to Elaine's talk, miscanthus is a very good crop to clean soil from contaminated metals because it allows to achieve very high biomass yields. A biorefinery strategy has to be chosen carefully in each specific case. For example, if we work with arsenic-enriched biomass, more likely combustion would be the best way to dispose the biomass, to treat biomass. Whereas if we deal with localized contamination with PGMs and we use hyperaccumulators, we may be able to recover high-value metals, and also we can obtain some additional chemicals like phenols or simple sugars, for example. And this is everything which I wanted to share with you today and talk about, and thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Maria. Now, the next item in our agenda is actually the review of the call. However, that was because we thought that the speaker that we have after that was not going to be available until 3:30. We've run on so spectacularly that it is now well past 3:30. So I think that Francis is actually with us now. So instead we will move straight, unless it makes a big problem, Dan. Thank you. We'll move straight to Francis Johnson's presentation, and then we will return to Emma for the call information.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me okay?
We can, yes.
Okay, great. Francis, I'm with the SCI in Stockholm. We have offices around the world in 5 continents, but also in the UK, actually, Oxford and York. So what I want to talk about today is to zoom out to the global level, and maybe it might not be directly related to the call, but I think it's important to be reminded of some lessons from the special report from 1 year ago, which are hopefully guiding this envelope of of change when it comes to bioenergy and land use. So I just want to mention a few points rather quickly today. Next slide. So just to remind that actually these efforts were long efforts to try to bring together 2 different issues. One is the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, and the other is the role of land. And the scenarios, that were used were very much coordinated. So it's a pretty solid body of evidence. Next slide. So this is just to remind this graph, which I think everyone has seen, and of course the issue in terms of sinks is the one closely connected to land use, how to invest in sinks, because the carbon will be there for quite a long time, but also the non CO2 forcers are going to be also very important to reach these targets. Next slide. So if we look at land use from a global perspective, it's interesting to compare the intensity of use and then the amount of land. And there it becomes pretty obvious. We have this big chunk in the middle of pastures of quite varying types all around the world, but it's a very significant amount of land. And here is perhaps the great opportunity for bioenergy. Compared to forests, which are already under tremendous pressure, accounting for around 22% roughly. So we can take the next slide. So in one of the key aspects in the report was to try to get a sense of these big land use impacts, including particularly mitigation, adaptation, desertification, land degradation, and food security. So the idea was to try to characterize some of the big measures, the most important measures, in terms of these impacts, the blue being positive and the red being somewhat negative. There was also a characterization which was more qualitative that was used, which was green for positive and gray for negative. Can take the next slide. So often we can talk about the big 4 measures in terms of land-based mitigation and removing carbon dioxide into sinks, and 2 of them are afforestation and reforestation, or forest restoration, if you prefer to think of it that way. And an important distinction to be made, and I think some of the specific research that was discussed earlier addresses this, that best practice, the difference between best practice and average is quite significant in terms of the big scale land impacts. And so without moving to best practice, we can run into trouble, particularly with food security. And so in terms of the big scale options that will be implemented in the coming years, much better attention to best practice for different regions is going to be crucial. Next slide. The other two within the big four are bioenergy and BECCS and biochar. And here again, the message is even more important on moving to best practice. There's such a diversity of measures when it comes to bioenergy that we know that there are some risks. So in a best practice context, we know that there will still be some land pressures related to food production, and these will in turn depend on policies to protect the vulnerable and governance. But without moving to best practice, we do face risks when it comes particularly to food security, but also land degradation. For biochar, the situation is a bit more complicated because there is a greater diversity of applications, but the message is quite similar in terms of some risks related to food security if we don't move to best practice. So next slide. But the good news is that the integrated response options have a good synergies across the SDGs. So looking at the blue dots, there was found in the literature quite positive impacts with strong evidence, and really only in a relatively few number of cases where there are quite negative impacts with evidence, let's say. So there are reasonable synergies across the SDGs, and that's something that's a bit different maybe with land use than perhaps with energy and industry sectors, is that with land use you get a lot of, let's say, potential win-win-win situations. And so how to take advantage of these is really the crucial goals that I think your research is focusing on, some of which was presented earlier. Next slide. So the interesting result, looking at most of you are familiar with the SSPs, the shared socioeconomic pathways, and an important difference in looking at these three SSPs is how much land is needed to meet our targets, how much land would be moving into bioenergy cropland, how much would go to forest and pasture and so forth. And what's interesting, if you look on the left, is the SSP1, which is where everyone wants to be in terms of meeting climate stabilization and resilience targets. And the amount of bioenergy cropland, it's quite a lot, but it's also starting to go down later in the century. In the middle of the road, it's quite a bit higher, and then even a bit higher in the resource intensive SSP5 on the right. So we have this somewhat funny situation, whereas the worse that we do overall, or let's say in other sectors, then the more bioenergy we need, which it's a funny result, but it has to do with the fact that we get mitigation and sinks at the same time. And but the problem is, of course, it reduces our flexibility in the applications in the future. So next slide. Yeah, so this is just to remind that in land instruments, again, a bit different from when we look in the energy or industry sectors, we like to choose instruments that cover a lot of aims and not just mitigation. So we want to see progress related to food security and extreme events, land degradation, all at the same time. And so some of the policy analysis and governance discussed in the report tries to review the literature for exactly where we can get these multi-valued instruments, let's say. Next slide. So just to conclude, I didn't realize they were separate bullets. Yeah, you can bring all the bullets down, I guess. Just to conclude, how we use land and biomass and bioenergy, it's really so crucial. We've been very focused in the global climate community, I think, on energy in the past decades, and more recently we've understood, I think, how crucial land and biomass is going to be. Acting early will reduce the risks, and land is an important part of the solution, but can't do it all. And this very interesting result that if we do a bad job in the other sectors, we actually need more bioenergy. So be careful what you wish for, I guess you might summarize it in that way, those of us who are work on bioenergy. And of course, sustainable land management needs to be mainstreamed, and this relates to integrated responses. And governance is going to be crucial, and even more important with land use than it is with land use and bioenergy than it is in some of the other energy and industry sectors. Okay, I think that's the end. If you go to the next slide. Oh, there was one more. Yeah, but that's okay. Yeah, so I just want to mention two projects, one on land use based mitigation and another on bioeconomy, in which we are putting a lot of effort right now. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks, Francis. Great to have an international perspective on this. So the next thing that we're going to do is Emma is going to very briefly run through the key points that are relevant for this particular call. We may then have time for 1 or 2 points of clarification. The vast majority of people on the call who may be preparing something have actually already presented, so I don't feel that we have a need to go round and ask for the round table. So over to you, Emma.
Okay, so my name's Emma Wild. I'm the Supergen Bioenergy Hub project manager, and I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the opportunities that we have available for funding within the Supergen Bioenergy Hub. Next slide, please, Dan. So at the moment we have various calls which are all coming up. So we will have a call which will be launched, sorry, it's not going to be launched in September, it'll be launched at the start of October for a challenge call for flexible funding for 2 projects of £100,000 each. And that call is going to focus on 3 areas. So we have anaerobic digestion and substitute gases, global land use change, which is the one we're looking at the moment, and algae and marine feedstocks. And we're holding a webinar on each of those in the next month to prioritise the ideas for the calls. In October 2020, we're also going to launch a call for up to 2 Supergen fellowships, and we will be holding a webinar to introduce those on the 14th of October as well, to help applicants steer their applications and try to get some more relevant applications this time. We also always have available rapid response funding of up to £25,000 per project, and there's an open call for that on the website, and any proposal that's submitted gets considered at the next management group meeting. In general, all Supergen, anyone who is a Supergen Bioenergy Hub member is eligible to apply for this funding. Next slide, Dan, please. So a little bit more about the Supergen Bioenergy Challenge Call. It's going to be launched at the start of October. The priorities are going to be identified during these webinars that we're holding at the moment. All proposals are expected to be collaborative with other institutions and aligned to the objectives of Supergen Bioenergy Hub. We also expect significant engagement with the Hub and expect you to present on your progress and results during our annual assembly meetings and researchers meetings throughout the year. All proposals should also deliver impact, which we can report to the research councils, because this is part of our Supergen funding programme, and we always need to report to them what we're doing with the money that they provide us. Next slide, Dan, please. So these are just the outline dates for the call. So we plan to issue it on the 5th of October. The closing date will be the 30th of November, and then we'll have the reviews complete by mid-January and make a decision on which projects get awarded, and then projects can start anytime from the middle of January onwards. And sorry, I've put the wrong date there for the completion date. It should be 2022, because projects are due to last for a year. Okay, I think that's a very quick roundup. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Emma. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask about the hub or about this particular call? If you do, we have a Q&A section where you can type them in. Okay, silence so far. Okay, if no one has any questions at all.
There's just one question saying, will the slides be made available, Patricia? And I guess, yes, they will be. And the recording will also be made available.
Okay, so if you are bringing forward a proposal and you have any questions, you have the contact details here for the different people you can get in touch with. I would suggest first port of call is probably Emma, and if you can't get her, then you can try myself or Dan. If you are wanting to propose something and want to check how it aligns with any of the particular topics that we are already working on and check to make sure you're not overlapping but are supplementing, please feel free to directly contact any of the leads for the topic groups that we have already mentioned and some of whom have presented today. And I think that otherwise we can, yeah, if you've got any questions that come up, do let us know. There will be a further 2 webinars around this funding call, one of which is focused on algae and one of which is focused on, remind me, Emma, what it is?
Anaerobic digestion.
Anaerobic digestion. Do we have dates for both of those yet?
Yes. The anaerobic digestion one is on the 23rd of September and the other one is on the 28th.
Okay, and can I particularly encourage anyone who is not sure about their or their institution's eligibility to contact Emma as soon as possible so that we can clarify A, if your institution is eligible, and B, any issues around your particular status. As I've already mentioned, we are really keen to be as inclusive as possible and to fund in places where other people find it difficult to fund. So we're happy to have discussions about that sort of thing, but we need you to come to us with the representation. Okay, thank you very much for your time, everyone, and have a good rest of afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.